The winter of 1899 arrived in New York with a vengeance, coating the cobblestone streets with treacherous ice and bringing winds that cut through even the thickest woolen coats. Gas lamps struggled against the darkness, their halos of light seeming to shrink back from the encroaching shadows that blanketed North Street. Among the cramped buildings that huddled together like frozen beggars stood the Sullivan boarding house, a 4-story brownstone with peeling paint and windows that rattled with each gust of wind. Margaret Sullivan stood at the front window, her thin face illuminated by the dim glow of a nearby lamp. At 48, her once auburn hair had faded to a dull gray, pulled back so severely that it seemed to stretch her skin. Her eyes, a watery blue, scanned the empty street with practiced vigilance. Behind her, her husband Thomas moved heavily across the creaking floorboards, his enormous frame casting a grotesque shadow against the faded wallpaper. "No one tonight," Margaret said, her voice carrying the lingering hint of her Irish heritage despite decades in America, the storms keeping them away. Thomas grunted, adjusting the suspenders that strained against his substantial belly. "We need someone soon. The money's running low." His thick fingers tapped against the ledger book on the side table, where columns of numbers told a story of dwindling resources. Their son William entered from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a stained cloth. At 26, he had inherited his father's build, but none of his imposing presence. His eyes darted nervously between his parents. "I've cleaned the basement again," he said quietly. "Everything's ready." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good boy, William." She turned back to the window, her breath creating a small cloud on the glass. "Perhaps tomorrow." People are always looking for shelter after a storm. As if in response, the wind howled with renewed fury, causing the entire house to creak and moan like a living thing in pain. Below their feet, beneath the worn floorboards of the Sullivan boarding house, lay secrets that the family had kept for nearly a decade, secrets that had fed them, clothed them, and allowed them to survive when so many others had failed. Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. 10 years now," he murmured. 10 years since we took in Mr. Holloway." Margaret's thin lips curved into what might have been mistaken for a smile. "And he's still with us, in a manner of speaking." William shifted uncomfortably. "Father, I was thinking, perhaps we could try something different. I heard the factory on Westbrook is hiring." "Silence," Thomas hissed, his face darkening. "We are not factory people. We are entrepreneurs. We provide a service, and we are compensated accordingly." "But the conversation is finished," Margaret said firmly, turning from the window. "Now let's prepare for bed. Tomorrow will bring what it will bring." As the family retreated upstairs, the floorboards creaked beneath their weight. In the basement below, something seemed to shift in response, perhaps just the settling of the old house. Or perhaps something more, something that remembered what it was to breathe, to hope, to live beneath the floorboards of the Sullivan boarding house on North Street. The morning brought a pale, watery sunlight that did little to warm the frozen city. Margaret Sullivan was already awake before dawn, methodically sweeping the front steps despite the bitter cold. The routine was important. Appearances had to be maintained, impressions managed. A respectable boarding house required immaculate front steps, no matter what lay beneath the floorboards inside. The street gradually came to life around her. Factory workers trudged past in threadbare coats, breath hanging in clouds before their pinched faces. A milk wagon clattered by, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones. Normal life in a normal neighborhood that was the illusion the Sullivans had carefully cultivated for years. The bell above the door jangled as Thomas emerged, adjusting his collar against the cold. "I'm going to check the post office," he announced, "and perhaps stop by the bank. See if any of our letters have received responses." Margaret nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. The Sullivans maintained correspondence with distant relatives of former guests, assuring them that their loved ones had moved on to California or Chicago or wherever dreams took people in those days. Occasionally, they would request additional funds for forwarding luggage or settling outstanding debts. It was a tidy supplemental income. As Thomas disappeared down the street, a figure appeared from the opposite direction. A young woman, perhaps 25, struggling with a heavy carpet bag. Her clothes, while not new, were of good quality, and her face, though strained with fatigue, showed the unmistakable signs of genteel upbringing. Margaret leaned her broom against the railing and smiled, warm and motherly. "Good morning, miss. You look half frozen. Might you be looking for accommodations?" The young woman stopped, relief washing over her features. "Yes, actually. I've just arrived from Boston, and my intended lodgings have fallen through. I was told there might be rooms available in this area." "Indeed there are." The Sullivan boarding house offers the finest rooms on North Street at very reasonable rates. Margaret gestured toward the door. Please, coming out of this dreadful cold. I'm Mrs. Sullivan, the proprietress. Clara Bennett, the young woman replied, extending a gloved hand. I'm most grateful, Mrs. Sullivan. Inside, Margaret busied herself with tea while Clara warmed herself by the fire in the sitting room. William, who had been dusting the banisters, paused at the sight of the new arrival, his eyes lingering perhaps a moment too long before his mother's sharp glance sent him back to his tasks. What brings you to New York, Miss Bennett? Margaret inquired, setting down a tray with teacups of thinning china. Clara accepted the tea gratefully. I've secured a position as a typist at the Manhattan Trust Company. It begins next week, but I wanted to arrive early to settle in. How fortunate, Margaret smiled, noting the quality of Clara's boots and the small gold locket at her throat. And will anyone be joining you, family perhaps? Clara's face fell slightly. No, Mrs. Sullivan. My parents passed 3 years ago. I have an aunt in Philadelphia, but otherwise I'm quite alone. Margaret's smile deepened, her eyes meeting William's across the room. Well, you're not alone anymore, dear. You've found a home with the Sullivans now. As Clara sipped her tea, unaware of the silent communication between mother and son, the floorboards beneath her feet seemed to sigh a house settling, perhaps, or something more. Something that might have been a warning if only she could have heard it properly. By mid-afternoon, Clara Bennett was officially installed in the third-floor front bedroom. The room was small but clean, with a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a window that overlooked the gray expanse of North Street. Clara had unpacked her meager possessions and now sat at the small writing desk, penning a letter to her aunt in Philadelphia. Dearest Aunt Harriet, I have secured lodgings at a respectable boarding house on North Street. The proprietors, Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, seem to be good, hard-working people. Their son William also lives here and helps maintain the establishment. The accommodations are modest but clean, and the price is more than fair, which will allow me to save a portion of my wages each month as we discussed. I begin my position at Manhattan Trust on Monday next. Until then, I shall acquaint myself with the neighborhood and perhaps visit the library. A soft knock at the door interrupted her writing. Miss Bennett? It was William Sullivan's hesitant voice. Mother asks if you'd care to join us for the evening meal. It's nearly ready. Clara opened the door, finding William standing awkwardly in the hallway, his large frame seeming too substantial for the narrow corridor. Despite his size, there was something almost childlike in his manner. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I'd be delighted, she replied. William's face brightened. We don't often have. That is, it's nice to have company at the table. As they descended the stairs, Clara noticed the peculiar way the house seemed to creak and settle, almost as if responding to their movements. This is quite an old building, isn't it? She remarked. Built in '63, William replied, during the war. Father says it has bones, whatever that means. He paused at the bottom of the stairs. Do you like it here so far, Miss Bennett? There was something in his tone, an eagerness, perhaps even a plea, that Clara found curious. It seems perfectly adequate, Mr. Sullivan, though I've only been here a few hours. The dining room was small, dominated by a heavy oak table that had seen better days. Thomas Sullivan already sat at its head, a glass of amber liquid before him. Margaret bustled in from the kitchen carrying a tureen of what appeared to be stew, the steam carrying the scent of boiled beef and root vegetables. Please sit, Miss Bennett. Margaret gestured to a chair across from William. We're simple folk with simple fare, but there's always plenty. As they ate, Clara noticed how the conversation consistently turned to her background, her finances, her connections, though the questions were couched in politeness. There was an underlying intensity to the Sullivans' interest that made her slightly uncomfortable. And no one knows you've come to stay with us? Thomas asked casually, spooning more stew onto his plate. No friends or colleagues expecting you elsewhere? Clara hesitated. Well, as I mentioned to Mrs. Sullivan, my aunt in Philadelphia knows I've found lodgings, though I haven't yet sent the letter with the specific address. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a quick glance that Clara couldn't quite interpret. You must write to her immediately, Margaret said with sudden enthusiasm. Family should always know where to find you. In fact, you must give me her direction as well. I like to keep in contact with the families of our boarders. It's a personal touch I pride myself on. As the meal progressed, Clara became increasingly aware of a strange odor that seemed to emanate from beneath the floorboards, a musty, organic smell that the food couldn't quite mask. When she mentioned it, the family's reactions were immediate and varied. Thomas scowled. Margaret laughed too brightly, and William stared fixedly at his plate. Old houses have their peculiarities, Miss Bennett, Margaret said dismissively. One grows accustomed to them. Later, as Clara climbed the stairs to her room, she could have sworn she heard voices beneath her feet, whispers and murmurs that seemed to follow her movements. Imagination, surely, fueled by fatigue and the strangeness of a new place. Still, she double-checked the lock on her door before returning to her letter, adding a postscript with the exact address of the Sullivan boarding house, just to be safe. Clara awoke before dawn, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The room was frigid, her breath visible in the gray light filtering through the thin curtains. She had dreamed of voices, muffled cries and pleas that seemed to rise through the floorboards like mist. Shaking off the lingering unease, she dressed quickly in the cold, preparing for her first full day in New York. Downstairs, the house was quiet. A note on the dining room table informed her that the family had gone to early church services and that she should help herself to bread and preserves for breakfast. Clara was secretly relieved. The intensity of the Sullivans' attention the previous evening had been somewhat overwhelming. After a simple meal, she decided to explore the neighborhood. The day was clear but bitterly cold, and North Street was largely deserted as she made her way toward the commercial district she had glimpsed during her arrival. As she walked, Clara found herself reflecting on her new lodgings and the peculiar family that ran them. The Sullivans were certainly attentive, perhaps too much so. There had been moments during dinner when their questions felt less like polite interest and more like interrogation. And William's behavior, that mixture of nervousness and eagerness, had struck her as odd. Then there was that smell from beneath the floorboards and the strange sounds in the night. Ridiculous, Clara muttered to herself, her voice carried away by the wind. She was letting her imagination run wild, influenced no doubt by the penny dreadfuls her aunt had always warned her against reading. The Sullivans were simply a family trying to make a living in difficult times, and old houses naturally had odd smells and sounds. She spent the morning exploring the nearby streets, noting the locations of shops and services she might need. Around noon, she stopped at a small cafe for tea and a sandwich. The establishment was nearly empty except for an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner and the proprietress, a stout woman with rosy cheeks who introduced herself as Mrs. Finch. "New to the neighborhood, dearie?" Mrs. Finch asked as she set down Clara's tea. "Yes, just arrived yesterday from Boston. I'm staying at the Sullivan boarding house on North Street while I begin a position at Manhattan Trust." At the mention of the Sullivan name, Mrs. Finch's friendly expression faltered momentarily. "The Sullivans, you say? Thomas and Margaret Sullivan?" Clara nodded, a flicker of unease returning. "Do you know them?" Mrs. Finch seemed to choose her words carefully. "Not personally, no. They keep to themselves mostly. That boarding house of theirs has seen a lot of comings, but not many goings, if you take my meaning." "I'm afraid I don't," Clara replied, her hand tightening around her teacup. The older woman leaned closer. "People check in, but they don't check out leastways. Not that anyone sees. The Sullivans will tell you they've moved on, gone west or whatnot, but nobody ever sees them leave." She straightened up, adjusting her apron. "Of course, that's just neighborhood talk. I'm sure it's nothing." Clara forced a smile. "I'm sure it is." "Still," Mrs. Finch added, "might be best if you let folks know where you're staying. Just as a precaution, in a new city and all." "My aunt in Philadelphia has the address," Clara assured her, though a seed of doubt had been planted. "And I'll be starting work on Monday. People will certainly notice if I don't appear." As she walked back to the boarding house, Clara tried to dismiss Mrs. Finch's insinuations as mere gossip, the kind that flourishes in close-knit neighborhoods. Yet she couldn't entirely shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The Sullivan house was quiet when she returned. She had almost reached the stairs when she noticed that the door to the basement, which she hadn't even realized existed, was slightly ajar. A strange compulsion drew her toward it. She peered down the narrow wooden steps into the darkness below, that same musty, organic smell rising to meet her. "Miss Bennet?" William's voice behind her made her jump. He stood in the hallway, his face pale, eyes wide with alarm. "That area is private. Family only. For storage." "I'm sorry," Clara stammered. It's dangerous down there," William interrupted, his voice strained. "Uneven floors, exposed nails. Father would be very upset if he knew anyone had gone down there." He quickly closed the door, and Clara heard the distinct sound of a key turning in the lock. When William turned back to her, his usual nervousness had been replaced by something harder, more insistent. "Please, Miss Bennet. Some parts of the house are not for guests. I'm sure you understand." Clara nodded, retreating toward the stairs. "Of course. I apologize for the intrusion." As she climbed to her room, she could feel William's eyes following her, and for the first time since arriving at the Sullivan boarding house, Clara felt something more than unease. She felt afraid. The Sunday dinner at the Sullivan boarding house was an uncomfortable affair. Clara could feel the weight of unspoken tension in the air, punctuated by Thomas Sullivan's occasional glances toward the locked basement door. Margaret was overly cheerful. describing the morning's church service in excessive detail while William sat silently, barely touching his food. "And how did you spend your day, Miss Bennet?" Margaret finally asked, serving apple pie that was more crust than filling. Clara hesitated, debating whether to mention her conversation with Mrs. Finch. Caution won out. "Just familiarizing myself with the neighborhood. It seems very... close-knit." "Meaning nosy," Thomas grunted, pushing away his half-eaten dessert. "People in this area talk too much and mind others' business when they should be minding their own." "Did you speak with anyone in particular?" Margaret asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "No one of consequence," Clara lied. "Just shopkeepers and such." William looked up suddenly. "You should be careful about believing what people say, Miss Bennet. They don't understand our family. They make up stories." "What kind of stories?" Clara asked, unable to stop herself. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Thomas cleared his throat aggressively. "Idle gossip, nothing more. People are jealous of those who make an honest living in hard times." "Of course," Clara murmured, though she noted that no one actually denied the existence of such stories. After dinner, Clara excused herself to her room, citing the need to prepare for her first day of work. Once there, she began to seriously consider whether she should remain at the Sullivan boarding house. Mrs. Finch's warnings, combined with the family's strange behavior and the mysterious locked basement, had set off alarm bells she couldn't ignore. She could leave now, find a hotel for the night, and seek different lodgings tomorrow. Yet that would mean forfeiting the week's rent she had already paid, money she could ill afford to lose. And what if she was simply letting an overactive imagination and neighborhood gossip influence her? The Sullivans had been nothing but accommodating, if somewhat intense. As Clara debated her options, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it cautiously to find William standing in the hallway, his large frame seeming to fill the narrow space. He held something in his hands, her letter to her aunt, which she had left on the entrance hall table to be posted. "I noticed you forgot to include our street number," William said, extending the envelope toward her. "Aunt Harriet might have difficulty finding us without it." Clara stared at the envelope, which had clearly been opened and resealed. "You read my private correspondence?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William had the grace to look ashamed. "Mother insists on knowing what's written about our establishment, for business purposes." Clara took the letter with trembling fingers. "I see. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mr. Sullivan. I'll be sure to correct it." "Miss Bennet," William hesitated, lowering his voice. I don't think you should stay here." Clara's breath caught. "What?" "The others who came before you," he continued, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "They didn't leave." "Not really." His voice dropped even lower. "They're still here, under the floor." A chill ran through Clara's body. "What are you saying, Mr. Sullivan?" William's face contorted with what appeared to be genuine anguish. I've said too much already. Just..." He stopped abruptly as a floorboard creaked down the hallway. "Write to your aunt. Tell her exactly where you are. Do it tonight." With that, he hurried away, leaving Clara standing in her doorway, the open letter clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Clara closed and locked her door, her mind racing. William's warning, coupled with everything else she had observed, painted a horrifying picture. She needed to leave immediately, but the streets of New York at night were hardly safe for a woman alone. She would have to wait until morning, slip out while the family was occupied, and go directly to the police. As darkness fell, Clara sat at her desk, rewriting her letter to Aunt Harriet. This time she included not only the address of the Sullivan boarding house, but also a desperate plea for help, detailing her suspicions and fears. She sealed the envelope and hid it under her mattress, planning to post it herself the following day, rather than entrusting it to the Sullivans. Throughout the night, Clara dozed fitfully, waking at every creak and groan of the old house. And beneath it all, she could have sworn she heard voices, muffled, desperate pleading voices rising from beneath the floorboards like ghosts that couldn't rest. Monday dawned gray and threatening snow. Clara had barely slept, but adrenaline kept her alert as she dressed in her best outfit for her first day at Manhattan Trust. Her plan was simple: leave for work as normal, but go directly to the police station instead. She would report her suspicions, post her letter to Aunt Harriet, and find alternative lodgings before nightfall. When she descended for breakfast, however, she found all three Sullivans waiting in the dining room, an unusual departure from their normal routine. "Good morning, Miss Bennet," Margaret said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We thought we'd see you off on your first day, such an important occasion." "That's very kind," Clara replied, accepting the cup of coffee Thomas poured for her with hands that she struggled to keep steady. "I'll walk you to the omnibus stop," William announced, not meeting her gaze. "The routes can be confusing for newcomers." Clara sensed this wasn't a genuine offer, but a means of ensuring she went where she claimed to be going. Quote, "There's no need, we insist," Thomas cut in, his tone brooking no argument. "William knows the city well." Trapped, Clara could only nod her agreement. She ate little of the breakfast provided, her stomach too knotted with fear to accommodate food. As she prepared to leave, she realized with a sinking feeling that her letter to Aunt Harriet was still hidden under her mattress. There would be no opportunity to post it now. Outside, the wind had picked up, bringing with it the first few flakes of snow. William walked beside Clara in silence, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. They were halfway to the omnibus stop when he finally spoke. "They know," he said quietly, not looking at her. "They know I warned you." Clara's heart raced. "What happens now?" "Father says you're too dangerous to keep. Too many connections. The company expecting you today, your aunt knowing where you are." He swallowed hard. "They've never had someone like you before. Usually it's immigrants, people without families, people no one would miss." "William," Clara whispered, "what have they done?" He shook his head, tears forming in his eyes. "I never wanted this. Any of it. But they're my parents. And once you've taken one person, it becomes easier to take another." They had reached the omnibus stop where several people already waited, huddled against the cold. Clara's mind raced. She could try to escape now, lose herself in the crowd, but where would she go? And what if William raised an alarm? "What will you do?" she asked, searching his face for any sign of the humanity she had glimpsed the night before. William looked miserable. "What I've always done. Follow orders. Survive." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her hand. "Hide this. Use it if you must." Clara glanced down to find a small brass key nestled in her palm. Before she could ask what had opened, the omnibus arrived and William stepped back. "Go to work, Miss Bennet," he said loudly, for the benefit of those around them. "Have a good first day." Clara boarded the omnibus in a daze, the key clutched tightly in her hand. As the vehicle pulled away, she saw William watching her, his large frame diminishing with distance until he was swallowed by the swirling snow. At Manhattan Trust, Clara was greeted warmly by the office manager, Mr. Phillips, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who showed her to her desk and explained her duties. Throughout the morning, she went through the motions of learning her new position, but her mind was elsewhere on the brass key in her pocket, on the voices beneath the floorboards, on the decision that awaited her at day's end. During her lunch hour, while the other typists chatted in the break room, Clara slipped out to the nearest police station. The desk sergeant, a burly man with an impressive mustache, listened to her story with increasing skepticism. "So you're suggesting this respectable family is, murdering their boarders?" he asked when she had finished. "Based on neighborhood gossip, strange noises, and the word of their possibly simple-minded son?" Put that way, Clara had to admit her suspicions sounded far-fetched. "I know how it sounds, but Miss Bennet," the sergeant interrupted, "do you have any actual evidence of wrongdoing bodies? Weapons? Witnessed violence?" "No, but then I suggest you either find more suitable lodgings if you're uncomfortable, or give the Sullivans the benefit of the doubt. They've operated that boarding house for years without incident." Defeated, Clara left the station. She considered not returning to North Street at all, but the snow was falling heavily now and she had nowhere else to go. Moreover, her belongings, including the money she had saved for months, remained in her room at the Sullivan house. As the workday ended and Clara joined the throngs of people heading home through the worsening storm, she made her decision. She would return, retrieve her possessions and her letter, and leave under cover of night if necessary. And if confronted, she had William's key, though what it opened she still didn't know. The streets were nearly deserted by the time Clara reached North Street, the snow having driven most people indoors. The Sullivan boarding house loomed ahead, its windows glowing with warm light that seemed to mock the cold dread settling in her stomach. Drawing a deep breath, Clara mounted the steps and opened the front door. Stepping once more into the house where people checked in but never checked out. The entryway of the Sullivan boarding house was quiet and dimly lit. Clara brushed snow from her coat and hat, straining to hear any sound of the family. From the dining room came the clink of cutlery against plates and the low murmur of voices. Dinner was in progress. Taking advantage of the moment, Clara quietly made her way upstairs to her room. Once inside, she locked the door and moved quickly, gathering her essential belongings into her carpet bag. The letter to Aunt Harriet was retrieved from beneath the mattress and tucked securely in her coat pocket. As she worked, Clara's mind raced through possible escape routes. The front door was too exposed, too likely to be noticed. The back door would lead through the kitchen where she might encounter Margaret. Perhaps a window. But the drop from the third floor would be dangerous if not fatal. A soft knock at her door froze Clara mid-motion. "Miss Bennet?" It was Margaret's voice, deceptively gentle. "We've been waiting dinner for you, dear. Won't you join us?" Clara cleared her throat, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm feeling rather unwell, Mrs. Sullivan. I think I'll just rest this evening." A pause. "I'm sorry to hear that. Perhaps some soup would help. I could bring a tray up." "No, thank you. I just need sleep." Another pause, longer this time. "As you wish. Thomas and I will check on you later. Rest well, dear." Clara listened to Margaret's footsteps recede down the hallway, then let out the breath she'd been holding. They would return later, which meant she needed to be gone by then. But how? The brass key William had given her suddenly felt heavy in her pocket. What did it open? Not her room, she already had that key. The front door used a different type of lock altogether. That left... the basement. The realization hit Clara with terrible clarity. William had given her access to the very place she had been forbidden to enter, the source of the strange smells and sounds. But why? What could possibly be down there that would help her escape? Unless... unless it wasn't about escape at all. What if the key was meant to provide evidence proof of the Sullivans' crimes that she could take to the police? Clara finished packing, then sat on the edge of her bed, the brass key in her palm. To use it meant returning to the ground floor, risking discovery by the family. Yet she couldn't leave without knowing, couldn't go to the police again without something concrete to show them. Steeling herself, Clara unlocked her door and stepped into the hallway, carpetbag in hand. She moved silently down the stairs, avoiding the spots she had learned would creak. Voices still emanated from the dining room, an argument in hushed, urgent tones. William's voice rose briefly, not right, not her, before being shushed by his father. The basement door was at the end of the entrance hall, partially concealed by a heavy curtain. Clara approached it cautiously, inserted the brass key into the lock, and turned it with a soft click that sounded deafening in the quiet hallway. Glancing nervously toward the dining room, she eased the door open and slipped inside, closing it behind her. Darkness enveloped her immediately, along with that same musty, organic smell, now much stronger. Clara fumbled in her pocket for the matches she carried and lit one, revealing a narrow wooden staircase descending into blackness. The flame illuminated only a few feet ahead, but it was enough for her to begin her descent, one careful step at a time. At the bottom of the stairs, the match burned her fingers, and she dropped it with a soft hiss of pain. In the momentary flare before darkness returned, Clara caught glimpses of a large, open space with dirt floors and stone walls. She lit another match and moved further into the basement, her free hand extended before her. The match's glow revealed a workshop of sorts, stables with tools, barrels of what appeared to be quicklime, and stacks of wooden planks. But it was what lay beyond these mundane items that drew a gasp from Clara's lips. The floor had been disturbed in multiple places, rectangular sections where the dirt appeared fresher, less compacted. Crude wooden markers stood at the head of each section, some with initials roughly carved into them. Clara counted at least a dozen such markers before her match went out, her hands shaking. Clara lit a third match and moved closer to the nearest grave, for she was certain now that's what they were. The disturbed earth gave slightly beneath her feet, and the smell was overpowering here, a miasma of decay barely masked by the chemical tang of quicklime. A sudden noise from above, the scrape of chairs being pushed back from the dining table, jolted Clara back to her present danger. She needed to leave now, but the fear that had been building inside her had congealed into a paralyzing horror. Her feet seemed rooted to the spot as her mind processed the evidence of multiple murders surrounding her. The match burned down, singeing her fingers again, but Clara barely noticed the pain. In the darkness, she became aware of something else, so faint she might have imagined it. A moan, weak and muffled, coming from the far corner of the basement. Fumbling for another match, Clara moved toward the sound. The new flame revealed another disturbed section of earth, but this one moved slightly, as if something beneath it was struggling. With a surge of horrified realization, Clara understood. Not all of the Sullivans' victims were dead. Some were buried alive. The basement door at the top of the stairs suddenly opened, flooding the staircase with light. Thomas Sullivan's voice boomed down. "Who's down there? Show yourself." Clara's time had run out. Dropping her carpetbag, she frantically scanned the basement for another exit. There was a small window near the ceiling, likely opening to the street level. It would be a tight fit, but it was her only chance. As heavy footsteps descended the stairs, Clara scrambled toward the window, dragging a barrel beneath it for height. Behind her, Thomas Sullivan's voice grew closer, now joined by Margaret's high-pitched commands and William's protests. "She knows everything now," Margaret was saying. "We have no choice. There are too many connections," Thomas replied grimly. "The company, the aunt. It's too dangerous." "Please don't," William begged. "Not another one. Not her." Clara reached the window and pushed against it with all her strength. It gave way suddenly, cold night air rushing in along with a cascade of snow. She pulled herself up, squeezing through the narrow opening as the Sullivans reached the bottom of the stairs. "Stop her!" Thomas roared, lunging forward. His fingers grazed Clara's ankle as she wriggled through the window, emerging onto the snowy street beside the house. Without looking back, she ran blindly into the storm, leaving behind her possessions, the evidence of the Sullivans' crimes, and the muffled moans of their still-living victims. Clara ran through the swirling snow, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. Behind her, she could hear shouts from the Sullivan house, Thomas's bellowing commands and Margaret's shrill cries. The storm had intensified, reducing visibility to mere feet, but it also provided cover as Clara stumbled away from North Street. She had no destination in mind, driven purely by the instinct to put distance between herself and the house of horrors. Her thin office shoes slipped on the icy cobblestones, and without her coat tube and in her haste, the cold cut through her clothing like knives. But the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her moving, even as her body began to protest. Eventually the voices faded, replaced by the howling wind and the muffled sounds of a city battening down against the blizzard. Clara slowed her pace, trying to orient herself in the white void. The street signs were barely visible, but she recognized the intersection of Fulton and Pearl. She had wandered east, toward the river. A gas lamp's glow revealed the facade of a hotel, the Maritime Inn, its windows still illuminated despite the late hour. With the last of her strength, Clara pushed through the door into the warmth of the lobby. The night clerk, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up in surprise as Clara stumbled in, covered in snow and trembling violently. "Good heavens, miss, are you all right?" Clara could barely speak through her chattering teeth. "Please ... I need a room." "And the police." The clerk hurried from behind his desk, guiding her to a chair near the lobby's small fireplace. "Sit here, miss. I'll fetch you some tea and a blanket." As warmth gradually returned to her limbs, Clara's mind cleared enough to assess her situation. She had escaped with only the clothes on her back and the letter to her aunt in her pocket. Her money, identification, and all her possessions remained at the Sullivan house. Worse, she had no proof of what she had witnessed, no evidence beyond her own testimony, which had already been dismissed once. The clerk returned with tea and a wool blanket, which Clara accepted gratefully. "Thank you. My name is Clara Bennett. I've just escaped from a terrible situation." She recounted her experience at the Sullivan boarding house, watching the clerk's expression shift from concern to disbelief as her story progressed. When she mentioned the graves in the basement, he shook his head slowly. "That's quite an accusation, Miss Bennett. The Sullivans have been in this neighborhood for years." "I know what I saw," Clara insisted, her voice stronger now. "There are people buried in that basement, and at least one still alive, I'm certain of it." The clerk hesitated. "I'll send for the police, but, well, it's a bad night. It might be some time before they can respond." "Then give me a room," Clara said firmly. "I'll wait for them there." The clerk looked uncomfortable. "I'm afraid we require payment in advance, miss. Some form of identification." Clara's heart sank. Without her documents or money, she was effectively stranded. Then she remembered the letter in her pocket addressed to Aunt Harriet but never sent. She pulled it out, showing the clerk her aunt's address in Philadelphia. "My aunt will vouch for me and cover any expenses. Please telegraph her in the morning. I have nowhere else to go." Perhaps it was the desperation in her voice or simply human decency, but the clerk nodded reluctantly. "Room 14, second floor. But I'll need to speak with your aunt first thing tomorrow." "Thank you," Clara whispered, relief washing over her. "And please, when the police arrive, send them to my room immediately, no matter the hour." Upstairs in the small but clean room, Clara locked and barricaded the door with a chair before collapsing onto the bed, fully clothed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the disturbed earth of the basement floor, the crude markers, and worst of all, the slight movement of fresh soil as someone beneath struggled for air. How many had there been over the years? How many travelers, immigrants, and lonely souls had sought shelter at the Sullivan boarding house, only to end their journey beneath its floorboards? And how many had been buried alive, a slower, more terrible fate than a quick death? Clara's thoughts turned to William. He had warned her, given her the key that enabled her escape. There had been genuine anguish in his voice when he protested against his parents' plans for her. Yet he had participated in their crimes for years, perhaps his entire adult life. Was he victim or accomplice? Could he be saved, or was he too far gone? Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the city the Sullivans were surely searching for her. Clara huddled under the blankets, watching the door, waiting for morning and the arrival of the police who might finally believe her story. Dawn broke with eerie stillness, the storm having spent its fury overnight. Clara awoke from fitful sleep to find sunlight streaming through the window of her hotel room. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind. Where was she? Then the events of the previous night came rushing back with terrible clarity. A knock at the door startled her, fully awake. "Miss Bennett?" "It's Sergeant Donovan, New York Police Department." Clara removed the chair from under the doorknob and opened the door cautiously. In the hallway stood a tall man in a police uniform, accompanied by the hotel clerk from the night before. "You requested police assistance, miss?" the sergeant asked, his weathered face betraying neither belief nor skepticism. "Yes," Clara replied, relief washing over her. "Thank you for coming. I need to report a crime. Multiple crimes, in fact." The clerk cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll leave you to it. Oh, and Miss Bennett, we've sent a telegram to your aunt in Philadelphia. Hopefully we'll receive a response soon." Once the clerk had departed, Clara invited the sergeant into her room and recounted her experience at the Sullivan boarding house in detail, the strange behavior of the family, the warnings from William, the mysterious basement, and finally, her discovery of the graves and the evidence of at least one victim still alive. Sergeant Donovan listened without interruption, making occasional notes in a small book. When Clara finished, he closed the book and regarded her thoughtfully. "Miss Bennett, I'm going to be frank with you. This is an extraordinary claim against a family that, to my knowledge, has never been the subject of police interest." Clara's heart sank. "You don't believe me either." "I didn't say that," the sergeant replied carefully. "But I need more than one person's testimony to obtain a warrant to search private property. Do you have any evidence, anything you brought from the house?" Clara shook her head miserably. "Only what I'm wearing. I had to leave everything behind when I escaped." Donovan sighed. "That complicates matters. However," he hesitated, then continued with a lowered voice, "there have been reports over the years. Nothing solid, mind you, just people inquiring about relatives or friends who were last known to be staying at the Sullivan house. The inquiries were always resolved. The Sullivans would produce letters showing the missing persons had moved on." "Forgeries," Clara said firmly. "They told me they maintained correspondence with relatives of their former guests. It's part of their scheme." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Perhaps, but without evidence, my hands are tied. I can increase patrols in the area, keep an eye on the house, but I can't simply raid it based on your story alone, compelling though it may be." Clara felt desperation rising within her. "There's someone still alive down there? By the time you gather enough evidence for a warrant, it could be too late." Donovan's expression softened slightly. "I understand your concern, Miss Bennett. Tell you what, I'll visit the Sullivan house today under the pretense of a routine check. If I observe anything suspicious, it might help build a case for further investigation." It wasn't the immediate action Clara had hoped for, but it was something. "Thank you, Sergeant, but please be careful. The Sullivans are dangerous, and they're likely looking for me." "That brings me to my next concern," Donovan said, rising to leave. "You should remain here until we've investigated further. If what you say is true, you're in considerable danger." After the sergeant departed, Clara paced the small room anxiously. The hotel had agreed to extend her stay until they received confirmation from Aunt Harriet, but that could take days. Meanwhile, someone was dying beneath the Sullivan house, and Clara might be the only person who could save them. A new determination formed in her mind. If the police wouldn't act quickly enough, perhaps there was another way to expose the Sullivans' crimes. The newspaper offices weren't far. Surely a story this sensational would interest them. And if public attention could be drawn to the Sullivan boarding house, the police would be forced to investigate thoroughly. Clara washed her face, smoothed her rumpled clothing as best she could, and prepared to venture out. The city beyond her window was transformed by the snowfall, the grimy streets temporarily beautified under a blanket of white. It would make travel difficult, but it also meant fewer people would be about, including, hopefully, the Sullivans. As she reached for the door handle, another knock sounded. Expecting the clerk with news of her aunt's response, Clara opened the door without hesitation and found herself face to face with William Sullivan. Clara stumbled backward, a scream rising in her throat, but William quickly pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes wide with panic. "Please," he whispered urgently, "don't scream. I'm not here to hurt you. I came to help." Clara retreated until her back hit the opposite wall, her mind racing. How had he found her? Should she try to escape past him? Call for help? The hallway behind William appeared empty, no sign of Thomas or Margaret. "You have 1 minute to explain yourself before I start screaming," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. William closed the door quietly but remained near it, as if understanding her need for a clear escape route. "I followed your tracks in the snow last night. I knew you'd seek shelter nearby, and this was the closest hotel." He looked down at his large, calloused hands. "Father and Mother are searching elsewhere. They think you'd go farther." "Why are you here?" Clara demanded. "To give you this." William reached slowly into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, which he placed on the table near the door. Your money and identification papers. I took them from your room before Father could search it. Clara stared at the pouch in disbelief. Why would you help me after everything? William's face contorted with anguish. You weren't the first I tried to warn, but you were the first to escape. He took a deep, shuddering breath. There's a woman still alive in the basement, buried 3 days ago. An immigrant from Italy with no family here. Maria Castellano. I heard her, Clara whispered. I tried to reach her, but I've been keeping her alive, William continued. Sneaking down at night with water, creating air holes. Father doesn't know. He thinks they all die quickly. Horror and pity warred within Clara. William, how could you be part of this? All those people. I was a child when it started, he said, his voice barely audible. 10 years ago, a boarder attacked my mother. Father killed him defending her. They were going to go to the police, claim self-defense, but double quotes, he swallowed hard. The man had money. A lot of it. And we were so poor then. So they buried him in the basement, took his money, and told anyone who asked that he'd moved on. And then it happened again. And again, Clara concluded, sickened. William nodded miserably. It became easier each time. For them, not for me. I tried to leave once when I was 20. Father. He said he'd kill Mother if I ever abandoned them or betrayed them. Said it would be my fault. Clara studied William's face, seeing the trapped boy beneath the man's exterior. And now, why help me now? Because it has to end, he said simply, and you can end it. The police officer who came here, I saw him leaving. Did you tell him everything? Yes, but he needs evidence. He can't search the house without a warrant. William's expression hardened with sudden resolve. Then I'll give him evidence. I'll testify against my parents. Clara stared at him in shock. William, are you certain? After all these years protecting them, I'm certain I can't live with myself if Maria dies. Or if they hurt you. He squared his shoulders. I know where Father keeps the ledger names, dates, amounts taken from each victim. And I know where they've hidden the belongings they couldn't sell. It's all evidence. Hope surged within Clara. We need to go to Sergeant Donovan immediately. Yes, but first we have to save Maria. Tonight after dark. Father and Mother will be meeting with a man about selling some jewelry they took from their last victim. The house will be empty for at least 2 hours. Clara hesitated, torn between immediate action and the chance to save a life. Can we trust you, William, truly? William met her gaze steadily for perhaps the first time. I've been a coward for 10 years, Miss Bennet. I can't change that, but I can try to be brave now. Something in his voice convinced her. Very well. Where shall we meet? The alley behind the house at 8 o'clock. Bring the police officer if you can, but don't tell him I'll be there. Not yet. Father has connections in the department. Paid them to look the other way when questions arose. The implications of corruption added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. I understand. 8 o'clock. William nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Miss Bennet, thank you for not seeing me as a monster, even though perhaps I am. After he departed, Clara sat heavily on the bed, the leather pouch containing her possessions clutched in her hand. William Sullivan, son of murderers, accomplice to their crimes, was placing his fate in her hands. And she, against all logic, was placing her trust in him. As dusk approached, Clara made her preparations. She had spent the day at the newspaper office, providing just enough of her story to ensure that if she disappeared, questions would be asked. She had also managed to speak with Sergeant Donovan again, convincing him to meet her near the Sullivan house that evening without revealing all her plans. At precisely 8 o'clock, Clara stood in the alley behind the Sullivan boarding house. Snow crunching beneath her feet, her breath visible in the frigid air. Sergeant Donovan waited at the street corner, out of sight but within calling distance as they had arranged. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the house, William, his bulky form unmistakable even in the dim light. They're gone, he whispered as he approached. We have until 10 at the latest. William led Clara to a cellar door at the rear of the house, a different entrance to the basement than the one she had used before. He produced a key, unlocked the heavy padlock, and pulled the doors open to reveal a set of stone steps descending into darkness. Stay close, he murmured, lighting a small lantern he had brought, and be prepared. It's not a sight for the faint-hearted. Together they descended into the chamber of horrors beneath the Sullivan boarding house, where a woman named Maria Castellano lay buried alive, and where the evidence of a decade of murders waited to be discovered. Whatever happened next, Clara knew that the boarding house of North Street would claim no more victims. Its dark secret was about to be exposed to the light at last. The graves looked even more numerous in the lantern's steady glow than they had appeared in the flickering matchlight of Clara's previous visit. William moved purposefully toward the far corner where a section of disturbed earth showed signs of recent attention. A crude breathing tube fashioned from a hollow reed protruded from the soil. Maria? William called softly, kneeling beside the grave. Maria, we're here to help you. Hold on. A faint moan emanated from the tube, barely audible but unmistakably human. William handed the lantern to Clara and began digging frantically with a small spade he had concealed beneath his coat. Clara set the light down and joined him, clawing at the earth with her bare hands, heedless of the damage to her nails and skin. We need to hurry, William urged. She's been down here too long already. Minutes that felt like hours passed as they excavated the shallow grave. Finally, their fingers found wood, a crude coffin made from the same planks Clara had seen stacked in the basement workshop. William worked the spade into a seam and pried upward, splintering the lid. Inside lay a young woman, perhaps 25, her face gray with soil and lack of oxygen, her eyes sunken but still open, still alive. Maria Castellano looked up at her rescuers with an expression of disbelief that slowly transformed into desperate hope. William lifted her gently from the coffin. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, dehydration and fear having consumed her. Take her, he instructed Clara. Get her to the sergeant while I find the ledger and the evidence. But there's no time to argue, William insisted. Father could return early. Take her up those stairs through the back garden to the street. The sergeant will see you. Clara hesitated only a moment before accepting the semi-conscious woman into her arms. Be careful, William. And thank you. As Clara struggled up the stairs with her burden, she heard William moving deeper into the basement toward whatever damning evidence he hoped to find. The night air felt impossibly sweet after the charnel atmosphere below, and Maria gasped weakly, drawing it into her deprived lungs. Help! Clara called as she staggered toward the street. Sergeant Donovan! The police officer appeared immediately, running toward them with his hand on his service revolver. His expression shifted from alertness to shock as he took in the sight of the half-dead woman in Clara's arms. Good God, he breathed, you were telling the truth. There are dozens more buried in the basement, Clara said urgently. William Sullivan is gathering evidence against his parents right now. We need to get Maria to safety and then return for him. Donovan took the weakened woman from Clara, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. I'll signal for backup. There's a patrol 2 blocks over. You can't, Clara protested. William says there are corrupt officers who've been protecting the Sullivans. We don't know who to trust. The sergeant's face hardened. Then we'll do this by the book. No chances. I'll get this woman to a doctor and return with officers I personally vouch for. Wait here. Do not go back into that house alone. But even as he spoke, a commotion erupted from the direction of the boarding house, shouting. A crash, and then a gunshot that echoed through the quiet night. Clara's blood ran cold. They're back early, she whispered. William, before Donovan could stop her, Clara was running back toward the Sullivan boarding house, driven by a desperate need to help the man who had finally found the courage to end a decade of horrors. Behind her, she heard the sergeant calling for her to stop, but she wouldn't abandon William to face his parents' wrath alone. The cellar door stood open as she approached, the lantern still burning where they had left it. Clara plunged back into the basement, following the sounds of struggle that echoed through the underground chamber. In the dim light, she could make out 3 figures. William, pinned against the wall by his father's massive bulk, and Margaret, her face contorted with fury as she brandished a small revolver. Ungrateful wretch. Margaret was screaming. After everything we've done for you? It's over, Mother, William gasped as Thomas's forearm pressed against his throat. The police know everything. Then we'll be gone before they arrive, Thomas growled. And you'll be just another body under the floor. Clara looked around desperately for a weapon, anything to help William. Her hand closed around a heavy spade leaning against a workbench. Without conscious thought, she charged forward, swinging the tool with all her strength at Thomas Sullivan's head. The impact was sickening, a dull thud followed by Thomas's roar of pain as he released William and turned toward this new threat. Blood streamed down his face from a gash above his eye, but he remained standing, reaching for Clara with murderous intent. Margaret swung the revolver toward Clara. You, she hissed. I knew you'd be trouble from the moment you arrived. A shot rang out, deafening in the confined space. Clara flinched, expecting pain, but it was Margaret who screamed, not in triumph but in anguish. William had thrown himself between them, taking the bullet meant for Clara. What happened next unfolded with nightmare swiftness. Thomas bellowed with rage and lunged for his wife, perhaps to take the gun, perhaps in blind fury at what she had done. Margaret, panicked, fired again. The second bullet struck her husband squarely in the chest. He stood motionless for a long moment, a look of confusion spreading across his face before he collapsed heavily to the earth floor. Margaret stared at the revolver in her hand as if seeing it for the first time. Then, with a terrible calm, she turned it toward herself. Clara lunged forward, but she was too late. The third shot echoed through the basement, and Margaret Sullivan joined her husband on the ground, blood pooling beneath her head. In the sudden ringing silence, Clara turned to William, who lay gasping on the floor, his hand pressed to his shoulder where the bullet had struck him. "William? Hold on, help is coming." "The ledger," he managed to say, pointing weakly toward a corner where a leather-bound book lay open. "It's all there. Names, dates, everything." Clara retrieved the book and knelt beside William, pressing her hand over his to staunch the bleeding. "You did it," she told him. "It's over. Maria is safe, and no one else will die in this house." William's eyes, so like his mother's in shape but utterly different in the kindness they held, met Clara's. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing the man I could have been, not the one I was." Footsteps thundered down the cellar stairs. Sergeant Donovan and two uniformed officers, weapons drawn. They surveyed the scene with professional detachment that couldn't quite mask their horror at what they found, not just the fresh bodies of Thomas and Margaret Sullivan, but the shallow graves of their countless victims, the meticulous record of murder in the ledger, and the workshop where they had planned and executed their crimes for a decade. In the days that followed, the Sullivan boarding house would become infamous throughout New York and beyond. Newspapers would call it the House of North Street Horrors and the Boarding House of Death. 37 bodies would eventually be recovered from beneath its floorboards, their identities painstakingly matched to the entries in Thomas Sullivan's ledger. Families who had wondered for years about relatives who had mysteriously moved west would finally learn the truth and find closure in their grief. William Sullivan, recovering from his wound in a hospital bed under police guard, would cooperate fully with the investigation, his testimony crucial to understanding the full scope of his parents' crimes. Public opinion would be divided on his culpability. Some called for his execution alongside his parents had they lived to face justice, while others saw him as another victim of Thomas and Margaret's twisted influence. And Clara Bennett, whose courage and persistence had brought the truth to light, would eventually return to her position at Manhattan Trust, carrying with her memories that would never fully fade, but also the knowledge that her actions had saved lives and brought an end to a decade of evil. The Sullivan boarding house itself would stand empty for years, a grim reminder of the darkness that had dwelled within its walls, before finally being demolished in the spring of 1905. The ground where it had stood would remain vacant, as if the city itself rejected the notion of building anything new upon soil so thoroughly soaked in innocent blood. But on that cold winter night in 1899, as William was carried out to an ambulance and Clara gave her statement to increasingly horrified police officers, one chapter in the dark history of New York came to a close. The boarding house, where guests checked in but never checked out, had claimed its final victims, its very owners, consumed by the evil they had nurtured for so long. And beneath the floorboards, the dead could finally rest in peace.